Now we're going to have a panel discussion that's entitled Rerun-ability, Repeatability, and Reproducibility in Cyber Experimentation. So I wanted to introduce our panelists, and once I've introduced them, I'm going to ask each of them to take about 10 minutes to give their thoughts on these 5 questions that were posed to them. And then for about a half an hour, we're going to let them question each other. I may ask them some questions, and then we will open it up to the floor to let other people ask. And also anyone who is on the live web stream, feel free to chime in with a question as well. We have someone watching that who will queue it up and make sure that the panelists get the questions. So on our panel, we have Lance Joneckis. He's with the Institute for Defense Analysis, a federally funded research and development corporation providing objective analyses of national security issues. He recently completed a study to identify options that could enable major advances in cybersecurity capabilities. In addition to his work for the federal government, he has also worked in the private industry in the areas of computer and communications. He received his PhD in physics from the University of Maryland in 1990. We also have with us Terry Benzel. Terry is the Director of Cyber Networks and Cybersecurity at the University of Southern California Information Sciences Institute. She is the Technical Project Leader for the Cyber Defense Technology Experimental Research Testbed Project, that's DETER, which is funded by DHS, NSF, and DARPA. The projects are developing an experimental infrastructure network and scientifically rigorous testing framework and methodologies to support the development and demonstration of next-generation information security technologies for cyber defense. Finally, we have Roy Maxion. Roy is a research professor in the Computer Science and Machine Learning departments at Carnegie Mellon University. He's also director of the CMU Dependable Systems Laboratory, where a range of activities, including computer security, behavioral biometrics, insider detection, usability, and keystroke forensics, as well as general issues of hardware and software reliability. In the interest of the integrity of experimental methodologies, Dr. Maxion teaches a course on research methods for experimental computer science and authored a 2012 paper entitled Making Experiments Dependable. He's on the electoral boards of the IEEE Security and Privacy and the International Journal of Biometrics, and is past editor of IEEE Transactions on Dependable and Secure Computing and IEEE Transactions on Information Forensics and Security. He is also a fellow of the IEEE. So why don't we start, Lance, with you, and then we'll work our way back.
Okay. As Laura said, we were given 5 questions to talk about. I'm actually going to start with the 5th question.
Should we use a microphone for this?
Yes.
Thank you.
Should I just stand at the podium?
Once you come. Really want the spotlight.
Is it on? Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. We were given 5 questions to address, and I'm going to start with the 5th question. And the 5th question asks, what was the role of cyber red teams in experimentation? And my perspective on that is, we've done some work on that at IDA, but my perspective is that they're absolutely essential in a cyber experiment that's trying to deal with defense or security issues. And I think that should be a pretty obvious statement, because in some sense, a hacker is part of the system in which you're trying to design something for, and to do an experiment without having someone represent the hacker is not really a faithful representation of what happens in the world. So the perspective I'm taking is that they are essential. And not only are they essential, they should have a very good skill set. Okay, that one skill set that's within the framework of what you think your system that you're testing is going to be attacked by. And the other aspect I want to get to, and I'll bring this up again, when you look at a cyber system, it's designed by somebody who applied some engineering principles, built a system. And I know that in this community, both in the DoD and in the larger in the larger world, there's been this notion of what is the science of security. No one's really been able to define it. And my perspective has always been, it's not the engineers or the designers that build the system that are the scientists. It's the hacker that's the scientist. And the reason the hacker is the scientist is very simple. It's because he's the one that's presented with a rule, or with a world. That world is supposed to have certain principles that the designers built into it. And he's the one that's going to understand what those principles are and how they can be violated. So he's the one that really approaches the problem from a scientific perspective. And the clearest that was ever made to me was at a Science of Security symposium about a year ago that was in National Harbor that some of you may have been at. But Mike Wertheimer, who was the director of research at NSA, spoke there. And he spoke at the Science of Security, and what he talked about was how NSA actually broke someone's code. And he said quite a lot about it. And when you heard him describe it, you really got the sense that the people that go after these things and break codes think very scientifically. And I think that from our perspective, it is the hacker that's a scientist. So the question becomes, why do you do experiments? And I think the reason you do experiments is because you want to improve your engineering. We tend to think of those engineering topics, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, as being really solid disciplines because they're basically built on scientific foundations. And so I think the reason we want to do experiments in cyber is to get that same type of power that those experiments in physics have given to engineering. And I think some of the ways we get confused is we like to take measurements, but not all. Just taking measurements doesn't make it an experiment. You've got to sit down and design an experiment. And what the experiment should do is try to get at some of the enduring principles that you're trying to then put into the way you design systems. A good example of that, going back to the crypto world, is the way crypto codes are designed. Organizations would not develop a crypto code just by having a bunch of mathematicians sit around and writing down some cryptography algorithm and saying this is it. They do it by not only designing it, but let people on the other side take it apart and see if they can break into it. A good crypto code is one that the people that know how to take these things apart, break into them, can't take apart. And more importantly, is the people that design them are sometimes also the people that break into them. They serve on both sides of the world. So I think you need that perspective in cybersecurity. And again, I think that's what the red team brings to it, is it brings that other part of the world into the picture. But I think the problem, as we all know it here, is the world of cybersecurity is probably a lot harder than cryptography. Cryptography sits on mathematics and certain design principles. And I think one of the interesting things about cryptography is those principles of design that are still present today were pretty much written down in the 1880s, over 140 years ago. Kirchhoff wrote down 5 principles of what makes a good crypto system. And if you look at those 5 principles, they're still true today, and they're still used today. I think it'd be pretty impressive if someone wrote down 5 principles of cybersecurity and they endured for more than a month, much less 130 years. But I think that's the reason why we want to do experiments, is to be able to establish this rigorous base for how we build cyber systems and get at these enduring principles. With that all said, let me turn to the other 4 questions, but I think the purpose of experimentation is to really validate these principles by which you will then build systems upon. And as I said, they need to have some enduring value. So the other questions that we were asked to address was, what does it mean by repeatability, to rerun an experiment, and to reproduce an experiment? To me, a repeat is you run several trials of the same experiment while you're in the laboratory. You see what answers they give you. You understand the properties of the noise or how variations in the outcomes are being understood. But you're basically building up statistics. When you start to rerun it, to me, what that really means is, hopefully, when you rerun it, you have some sense of not only what principle it is you try to establish, but also when that principle holds and when it doesn't hold. So when you rerun experiments, you should be able to start to understand whether or not what you say is a principle really seems to be a principle. And I think reproduction just takes it into a larger, when you reproduce it, you just take it into a larger context. I mean, if you have something that's an enduring principle, it's going to stay around. The other question that we were asked to address was, what happened if the reproduced results do not agree? Actually, let me step back. We had, what does it mean to repeat an experiment and if the answers you get don't agree with previous answers? Well, that happens a lot of times. You've got to look at what is different. I mean, I think we pretty much know this. But when you have a principle, you have to really understand what influences and what doesn't influence. And so those are the things you change when you do an experiment. You do a sensitivity analysis. If I change this, does it really change the results that I get? If the answer is no, then you kind of have some sense that that factor may not be important into what it is you're trying to show. So I know this is a very hard field, And it's not easy to do this type of stuff, but I think this is the way cyber experimentation tries to put, or can try to put some principles and some enduring principles into cybersecurity.
Well, thank you. I think that's a good way to get us started. I'm very happy to be part of this panel, as a lot of my research has been around creating experimentation capabilities and facilities and doing the research into how to do experimentation. And one of our mission statements is about bringing science into cybersecurity experimentation. But I think it's a very hard problem. We've been working on it for a long time. So I want to try and sort of take apart a little bit some of the questions we were asked. So one of the first questions was sort of rerun-ability versus repeatability. And so this was an excellent opportunity to really sit back and think about some of these topics, because repeatability is a nice hallmark in science, but if we're talking about conducting experiments and or using red teams, then the notions of repeatability need to be tied to what are the characteristics that are important. Because if we're conducting an experiment on a computer or a set of computers, there may be a lot of ways in which they're not 100% faithful to a previous experiment. And so we need to have what our boundary kinds of conditions are. So I think it's important to look at what's a spectrum of repeatability. So, we might look at a simulation. If we ran a simulator, on a standalone computer with no random number generators in there, very static, then one might believe that could be, reproduced or repeatable with a high degree of fidelity. Now, if we start introducing, and in a simulator, we may start introducing some random number generator, depending on how we seed that random number generator. Now we've introduced a certain amount of difference between each repeatable instance of an experiment. And then we get to, emulation or running on real hardware nodes, and now we may introduce some more, non-determinism into the experiment. So I think we need to understand in an experimental context the difference between repeatability versus what I might call process repeatability. That is, I should be able to repeat the procedure given that I've written down and defined a scientific procedure versus actually repeating every aspect of it. So I would say that a repeated experiment is one in which we can repeat the process or the procedure. We have procedural recipes and elements that can be repeated with some high degree of fidelity and faith, and we can analyze the results. So just as in the excellent presentations we had this morning, both from Alessandro and from Rebecca, there were questions of how they could repeat some of the results that they were getting, and to be able to look at what were the differences that they incurred. So it's clear that we need to analyze that. And then we need to be very clear about the definitions of what characteristics count. So now that takes me then to answering the question about what are the characteristics for replication of experimental results. So here I say it's important to define what counts. We tend to look at that from two different vectors. One is temporal repeatability, and the other one is spatial repeatability. Now, when I'm looking at temporal repeatability, that is over time, can I do repeated runs of the same experiment to gather statistics, right? Multiple enactments of the exact same procedure. Then there are some places where some non-determinism may creep in, and I need to understand, where those problems may come about. Do I have exactly the same configured physical apparatus that I run on? Can I run multiple runs and trials? Do I vary some of the variables, which would be part of your motivation, in fact, to do that? And can we understand statistically what the significance is in the results? So the sources of non-determinism then in this procedural temporal repeatability comes from the variability in the allocated hardware that we ran on, different traffic models that we might use in a network analysis, whether there's some interaction with the real internet, and so we look at different kinds of experimental clusters, whether there's some transient hardware or software failures that we might incur, or whether we're looking at using some dynamic shared resources. So we need to be able to lock those down and determine whether or not those are affecting our results. In the area of spatial repeatability, that's more the case where I might want to have an experiment I've done and hand it off to a third party for their analysis of it and for them to be able to repeat it. Or I might want to come back and repeat an experiment that I did many, many years ago, just as Rebecca tried to do with something from from the 1960s. And there we need to be able to understand, what were the key factors of that experiment when it was first done. And we need to be clear that we haven't introduced any omissions in the description. So in Rebecca's case, the omission in the first description when she attempted to rerun this experiment was that they had used a partial t-index instead of an independent t-index. So if we know this up front, then we can understand what we're looking at in terms of that. So then again, non-determinism can come about in a network kind of an environment with variability in devices and in underlying infrastructure that's used for an automated experiment. So then Laura asked us about, well, what happens if you get different kinds of results when you've reproduced experiments? Again, I'll harken back to, if we have an a priori definition of what counts, what are the important characteristics of a repeated experiment, or what are the characteristics of an experiment? I've often felt and talked to my experimenters about sort of taking it from a formal verification point of view. If I can have, entry and exit conditions in a way, if I have a formal statement about this experiment, is meant to show this hypothesis with these kinds of results, and these are the things which must be held true on entry and exit, then I'm much better able to handle some of these variants that come about. In order to handle these variants, I think that I suggest that we should be devising, metrics for quantifying what's our variability. So again, I also sort of envision having, boundary conditions or ranges of variability in a sense of a repeated experiment that we can tolerate, and that we can have contracts between ourselves. If you want to repeat my experiment, I can give you sort of a metrics of agreement, a contract statement about what must be true about this experiment in order for it to be valid. And then, the red team question, while I certainly appreciate and understand what Lance, put out, and I'm glad he started with that, and the science does come from the hacker community, being someone who's in the business of trying to run, a test bed that gives you repeatable results, introducing the red team introduces the human factor, and whatever steps the red team took today to break it versus the steps they're going to take tomorrow are going to be slightly different. And so, clearly needs to be taken account of, and certainly the human role is the key. There's no question about that. I'm not dismissing that. But from a scientific basis in an experimental infrastructure environment, how do we account for the variability in the human that introduces different factors? And we find even in the test bed that we see differences between different runs that have been introduced by the person running it. And so we've been building up more infrastructure to make that more automated to reduce some of that variability. So I think that those are my opening remarks. I will say, as a short plug, I do have some flyers or brochures about the Deter Cybersecurity Experimentation Facility and Research Project, and also for all you graduate students. Assuming we get our money from the government, we're looking to hire.
Okay, so I'm going to just sort of kind of go right down the line up here. And before I answer the first question, I want to ask, what is this thing that we call an experiment in our world? And I'd like to point out that there are lots of different kinds of things that we all call experiments, but most studies in cybersecurity aren't experiments. They're more quasi-experiments with no control conditions. So you just gotta wonder if whatever these different kinds of studies are, we ought to apply principles of rerun-ability or repeatability or reproducibility in different ways to these different kinds of undertakings. So an experiment formally is a procedure in which some intervention is deliberately produced to observe its effects, or it's an empirical method that arbitrates between competing models or competing hypotheses or competing claims. And there are lots of kinds of experiments, like I said. And usually in the literature, what you see is that the different kinds of, I'm loosely calling them experiments here, but really they're just kind of studies, all except for one. These different studies have different power or different strength of evidence, right, to lend credence to whatever your outcome is. And the very lowest level one is called a case study. And that's a descriptive or exploratory analysis of some person or event or object, like, for example, a particular hack or a particular hack. Some analysis of that would be a case study, not an experiment. Then there's a cross-sectional study, which would be an observational study of some particular population or some subpopulation done at some specific point in time, like a study of network vulnerabilities, you know, in 1990 or 1995 or 2000. Then there's a case control study, which is also an observational study, but cases of interest are measured against cases of controls. So, for example, one protocol versus some other protocol would be a case control study. Then there's a cohort study, and I'm mentioning these things in order of the strength of evidence that they bring to bear on a hypothesis. A cohort study is an observational longitudinal study that tracks a group of something, some subjects, objects, devices, whatever, over time. So, for example, the behaviors of machines in an organization over time. Then there's something that's called a true experiment. And that's what most people would call a randomized controlled trial. And that's a study that randomly assigns objects of study to treatment and control groups, where the objective of the random assignment is to wipe out bias. And the reason that that's kind of the gold standard is because it has such tight controls for bias, whereas all the other study types that I mentioned so far lack that element. And finally, at the top of the heap is something called a meta-analysis, which is a statistical analysis of many combined studies, usually randomly controlled trials, that are just the same problem, but what you get is a greater statistical power, and the meta-analysis is considered to be the strongest form of evidence. Of course, it has to be based on a properly conducted randomized controlled trial in order to be valid. So getting to question number one here, what are the differences? I think these questions are right up here, right? So rerun-ability, I actually don't know what this is. This is not a term I heard of, and just in case I've been daft for all these years, I asked some colleagues who've been in the business for maybe longer than I have, and they said they didn't know either, so I'm not sure what this means. But maybe it has to do with rerunning simulations, for example, or big cranker jobs that are hard to restart, or non-deterministic programs. Simulations and programs of these types are usually started with certain parametric values. So it's useful, maybe even essential, if you're going to rerun these things, you want to restart these things with the same parametric values that you began with in the first place. So one example of something maybe, I don't know, not really close to cybersecurity, but games, right? Games, right, from like Electronic Arts, places like that. Their behavior is usually not the same on every run. So then the issue becomes, well, how do you repeat an experiment or whatever kind of study you're going to do with games? I don't actually know that, but I suspect it's done with scripts. So now, what do we mean really by these terms, repeatability and reproducibility? So in the literature that I'm familiar with, repeatability refers to the variation in repeated measurements taken by a single person or a single instrument on the same item under the same conditions. And what you're looking for there is high agreement from one measured instance to another. And a measurement is said to be repeatable when the variation is smaller than some agreed limit, like measurement errors, for example. A measurement error, I mean, like, for example, if you're trying to measure something, that's got a certain length, and your measuring stick is only graded in inches, well, then you're going to have a measurement error of maybe around half an inch. So that's what we mean by measurement error. Reproducibility differs from repeatability in that reproducibility relates to the agreement of experimental results with independent researchers using similar but different, but physically different test apparatus and different laboratory locations, but are trying to achieve the same result as was published in the original article. So reproduction actually permits an assessment of the control on the operating conditions, i.e. the ability to reset the conditions in the environment to some desired value. So ultimately, reproducibility estimates the control over the procedure that was used. Where do you get this procedure? Usually out of the method section of whatever paper you're reading, if in fact the paper contains a method section at all. So this, right, so the second part of this question was, when are these important? Kind of a hard thing for me to answer, since I think they're always important. But you know, it's important to verify that one person's findings are stable enough to be discovered or observed more than one time, right? You know, you look at something and you go, huh, really? Like, I mean, like in the study we saw this morning, right? You just go, well, hang on, I mean, shouldn't I have got this other result, right? And so, well, that's interesting. Or sometimes you read a paper and just on the basis of whatever you happen to know, you just go, I don't believe that, right? So you want to just check it out. You want to verify that findings aren't artifacts of a particular experimental method. So that was on offer this morning, right? So for example, was it the case that an experiment got a particular result because it was offered on a tablet computer as opposed to pencil and paper? Okay, well, there might have been an artifact in either case, right? So the right thing to do is to check it out. Another time when it's important is so that you're able to start off where somebody else left off. So maybe some people who are here are familiar with Richard Feynman's 1974 commencement address at Caltech. If you're not familiar with it, you ought to go to the web and read that thing because it's really great. But basically, in that talk, he discussed a psychology experiment where they're trying to understand the searching behavior of rats in a maze. Okay, and what they're trying to do is remove all the cues to see if a rat could really actually remember which turn to take. And you know, they did things like disinfect the maze, right, or totally clean it, or try to remove all confounding factors. And the rat always seemed to know which way to go, right? And the experimenter just couldn't understand that. And finally, what happened was, it turned out it was the sounds of the rat's feet on the floor of the maze. And when the sound then was deadened from that, then the experimenter got what he wanted, right? So that's just an exercise in figuring out what is really the base behavior of the rat. But the message that Feynman had was for a student who wanted to extend that result, and that student had just reached the conclusion, okay, we know about that now, so let's go on and do the next thing. And Feynman said, no, what you have to do is to build a maze exactly like that previous researcher did and confirm that you got exactly that same behavior, and from that point, you can start to extend the work. So that's another reason why you want to be able to reproduce somebody's work. So for me personally, a big benefit of making an experiment reproducible is that it helps me to think about the details of an experiment. It helps me to flesh out the details much more than I might otherwise have. I always write down the details. I make my students write down the details because it makes my experiment more repeatable, and it also makes me plan better. As I sometimes say to my students, writing, you know, when you write something down, writing is nature's way of showing how sloppy your thinking is. So to write this out in a method section just helps everybody, including you. Second question up here, what counts as having repeated an experiment? I think, you know, there's different positions on this. For me personally, it would be when all the steps of the experiment have been done and all the results are within measurement error, or at the very least, passing the sniff test in a Gedanken experiment where you at least rerun in your mind, is it really plausible that somebody following this particular methodology as laid out in a method section, could it really have resulted in the outcome that they have? You could also repeat something on a different population, right, to see what the population effect was. could reanalyze a data set, which many people have done. We could reuse an algorithm with a different data set. So all these things count in some sense as having repeated an experiment, but some only partially. And the first thing I said, probably more significantly. The third question is, if it's not possible to replicate an entire experiment, how do you determine which aspects are critical for replication and which aren't? So I would say, well, maybe it depends on why the full replication isn't possible. The question I always ask, and I teach this to my students in class and my grad students, you look at some phenomenon, you look at some claim, and you just ask one simple question. Is it true? And if you can figure out that it's really plausibly true, well, maybe you don't have to replicate it. Or if there's any doubt in your mind, maybe you ought to check that out. Right? As a famous journalist, I think there's a famous old saw in journalism, and it goes like this. Your mother says she loves you? Check it out. Okay, so given that I personally had a choice of which parts to replicate, I think the thing I'd choose first would be the part of the experiment that had the greatest uncertainty or the greatest variability, or maybe where I had the biggest number of doubts. Right, so I know of an experiment in my field where somebody asked some subjects to do something 12,000 times. Okay, I don't know that I'm really up for replicating that, but it does sort of raise some doubts in my mind as to really what happened in an experiment like that. It was just kind of hard to believe. And I would just look carefully at the parts of the method, right, if it's in fact there at all, to see if there's any parts of it that you find questionable, especially as you go through the method in your Joneckis experiment. Next question, what should be done if the results of a reproduced experiment are different from the original? Well, again, that depends on your own goals. Maybe you're trying to build on previous work, or you're just checking a new result. And we heard this story already this morning, and I actually was sharing with somebody else late in the morning. I have had this happen to me, right? So just last year, we were working on something that relied on somebody else's paper. And we looked at this paper and we tried to use the results, and it just wasn't panning out. And so finally we looked at the paper a little harder. And then we said, well, hang on a second, could this really be true here, what this says? And then it turned out it wasn't true. And then it turned out that we exactly found out what was wrong with the paper. So what do? I phoned up the author of the paper and I said, did you realize, that there may be a problem just on this page in the paper? And the guy says, well, let me look at it and get back to you. And a couple of days later, he did. He sent me an email and he said, you're right. He said that the only thing that's more surprising is that the paper's been out in the literature for, 10 or 15 years, and you're the first person who saw this error. So what do? We said, well, maybe we ought to fix this. So why don't we team up together, right? You guys in your lab, our guys in our lab, we'll just write a joint paper and we'll put the thing to rest. And then from now on, people in the literature will have the right answer. So, if results can't be reproduced these days, this is starting to be a bigger and bigger and bigger deal. You're starting to see more articles. I mean, there was a big expose in Science not very long ago about unreproducible work. And I can tell you one thing, that I personally would not want to be in that hot seat, right? If somebody couldn't reproduce something that I've done, I don't want to be there. I guess the other thing you could do is to say in your own follow-up work that you just couldn't reproduce it. Here's a counterexample that I offered. I'm not attacking the original author. I'm only saying there was this methodology that was used, and one group got one result, another group got another result. There must be something wrong in here somewhere. Maybe it was my mistake. Maybe it was somebody else's mistake. But the fact that I offered a counterexample might spur somebody else to say, oh, okay, I see what the path is here. And the last question, where does red teaming fit? So I guess what I would say is that, I should read the whole question. This is not a question that says, what is the role of red teaming? It says, where does it fit? Well, I guess it does say that, right? But the part that I tended to was, how can one achieve rerun-ability, repeatability, and reproducibility using a red team? So I guess my reaction to that is presuming that you have the same environment, right, from one run to another, like somehow you manage to reset all of your systems to the same state that they were when the red team came and paid you a visit. And that's not easy to establish, but if you're able to do that, then all the variability lies in the skills and constituency of the red team. So I would say it's quite hard to replicate a red team with the same skills and personalities and experiences of the original red team that you might have had in. And even if you did have the original red team in, by that time, that red team is no longer valid because they have the experience of already having looked at your system, right? So it's really, it's really a catch-22. So as my personal opinion is we probably shouldn't be using penetration testing or red teams as demonstrations of computer security unless the red team is vetted, but then that's yet another measurement problem. So in summary, I would just say that for me personally, reproducibility is important because it emphasizes the science, what we're supposed to be building on, instead of the pizzazz or the bright, shiny objects. And again, for me, it's the lack of good science that besets the field right now. So we don't need more clever parlor tricks. We don't need more bright, shiny objects. What we need is some basic underpinnings for good science. And I think we can all help to address the problem by at least specifying in our papers all of the details that are needed for reproducibility.
Thank you. So I want to get back to the point that actually all of you talked a little bit about the red team. That's interesting to me because I was involved in the early information assurance program at DARPA. Some of you may be familiar with that. And in that program, there were a lot of experiments that were set up and run with a red team. And so the question in my mind is, if those experiments were not repeatable, how can we rely on the results from them? What did we really learn from them? And so, Roy, for you, I would ask, so you laid out case studies and controlled case studies, and cohort studies, et cetera. Is there a place where a red team fits in one of those areas?
Yes, offhand, I would say it's in the case study. A red team would be a case study. And if you remember the order in which I went through those things, right, and from sort of low to high, the case study was at the bottom of the stack, and that had the lowest quality of evidence to bear on a hypothesis.
So I think there's some value in the red team is if we can set up the environments to have some control factors with them so that you can kind of create a level playing field so that when the red team comes in and does an experiment, we've at least held constant some of the variables that are there. Their techniques, absolutely are unique in each and every instance, and like everybody has said, even the next time, 5 minutes later, when they do something, they're going to do it slightly differently, right? But there still is something that can be gained if we have a common framework or an environment in which to operate from that makes those results balanced.
I guess the one thing I would like to add is, cybersecurity is really an adversarial environment. When you deal with true science issues, you don't have science trying to make your life difficult in ways you can't understand. Science is hard, but at least it maintains the consistency over time. And when you're trying to do cybersecurity, you fundamentally are in an adversarial relationship, and if you don't account for that adversarial relationship, if that's an important part of your experiment has limited validity in what you can do with it. And I do agree, we did a pretty extensive study on red teams, and I think it's really hard to find the right red teams. I don't know that they exist, because most red teams have a certain toolbox. and they kind of look for nails, and they kind of bang the nails down because that's what they pull out of their toolbox is the hammer. And that's not, and I don't think that's sufficient. I mean, I think you know, and I would go back to the crypto analogy again. And the crypto analogy says the red team there are mathematicians, and they're mathematicians that live on both sides of the world. They live on the design side and they live on the breaking side. You know, I think a red team needs to be a much more skilled set than someone walking around with a hammer.
I think that you could imagine some sort of a score system, like maybe you have a score from 0 to 100 about whatever red teams do, like the security of your system. So if you get a score of 80 from one red team, and you get a score of 90 from some other red team, and maybe a score of 70 from a third red team, what are you supposed to do with that?
Now you got them in the audience.
Well, Laura, I'll let you moderate.
Well, okay, and
One of the alternative approach, other than a science approach, is a risk management approach where you assess threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences, and you use that in some sort of a formula that enables you to make sure that you're putting most of your work into the highest consequence sorts of things. And the question I have is, how do you respond to someone who considers cybersecurity to be a risk management problem in a way that compels them to think of it in terms of an experimentation in the science?
Okay.
Well,
I think that's a very sensible idea. I think if you determine that there are certain classes of vulnerabilities in the system, then that exposes you to a certain measure of risk. And it's not like we don't know quite a lot about how to assess risk or the perception of risk. That's been decades-long undertaking by guys in risk analysis. So I think it's a fine place to start.
I guess I just have a comment, and again, I'm going to go back to my favorite analogy, which is the crypto analogy. I mean, that's a risk management too, because any crypto system can be broken, right? It's just a question of how much resources are you willing to put at it, what are you willing to do. So I think what you fundamentally set up is you say, in this type of environment for which I'm designing the system, I expect people to only do this and not really go beyond that. And you set that limit high enough. And so if in that world someone finds a way to break the system, what you do is you don't say, well, let's let it go. It's only one person found out how to break it. You use that information to try to repair it and try to say, what did I have to change about it so that he won't be successful the next time? And I think it's that feedback that the red team can provide that the designer sometimes is missing, is where the vulnerabilities are.
Just to add to this, one wonders, I actually don't know what the current state of this is, but people have wondered for some time, why don't insurance companies, who are in general pretty good at gauging risk, why don't they get into this? I don't know what the answer to that is, except maybe that their judgment is that it's that they can't even measure it, right? Because there's really not enough base information. I don't actually know, but it just seems to me that insurance companies, right, risk analysts would be well positioned to do something like what you said.
Because if they don't get it right, they lose money.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they do know how to measure that.
yeah, it's one of the two things. So, so I'm wondering, is there something that we can do though where we could make it where we could actually effectively use a red team? So can we capture what they're doing? So they're going to dynamically try to find a way to break into a system. Can we capture what they've done and script that and then rerun it? Because what you ultimately want to do is try different system designs or variations, right, to see what works better, and you need to be able to repeat.
Well, yeah, except that what you're talking about, Laura, is not repeatability or reproducibility, right? So you're introducing new things into the mix, which I think is fine, right? And I must say, I don't want anybody to construe my remarks as meaning that red teams are worthless and have no use. No, I'm not saying that at all. I was only responding to the question about repeatability of the use of a red team, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, we've been providing the Deter test bed as an assessment vehicle for a large DARPA program for 3 years now, and they have a very skilled in that particular area, red team that's in there, doing that. And one of the questions we constantly have is, how can we capture those results so that we can rerun them or validate them? We create baselines before the red team comes in. We look at what they've done afterwards. I think that I'm a little disturbed actually by the conversation drifting so much into the red team focus, because I think it has moved us from some of the higher level abstraction principles. And so, I mean, what I see about the principles about repeatability and reproducibility, is really where we need to focus the question and the discussion. Is more about what are the characteristics that allow us to do cyber experimentation in such a way that it could be reproducible. Because unfortunately, to a large extent, it's not. And so the only other thing I'd say about the red team, though, that I find quite fascinating, and I really appreciate Lance's remarks in that area, is take away the word red team and just say adversary. So, I think that Lance is quite right. I mean, the adversaries are conducting science experiments. And one reason they're conducting science experiments is they get the opportunity to do unlimited observation, and they get to control their variables, modulo the internet and all the different changes that are out there in the world. But I mean, at the gross level, right, the adversary is sitting there observing all of us in a test tube, right, and gets to poke at it as many times as they want, essentially, unnoticed and undeterred by us. And so they are conducting a science experiment. And what kind of science experiment, should we be doing at that global level, to respond?
We talked enough about red teams. I agree with you.
Enough about it.
Yes.
Okay, Sam?
So, I was talking this with Roy and sort of comment that nobody here has so far mentioned any qualitative experiments yet.
Any what?
Other
Qualitative.
Other areas of science that's basically the bread and butter. Take anthropology, for instance, you can't replicate Marvin Reed, but who cares? You're getting information. I think the real issue is there's two factors: the confidence that the results are accurate and relevance of the results. And so repeatability gets into the confidence, how confident are you the results are accurate. But usually, I argue in our field, doing so decreases the relevance. Anyone can get a nice accurate measurement to 12 decimal places of your accuracy of your spam detection against 10-year-old spam. But who cares? Because we care about 10-year-old data. We don't care about 10-year-old data, we care about what's happening next, tomorrow. And so you don't really want to keep measuring using benchmarks and old benchmarks because it's not relevant. And you get one of the nicest papers I just read a couple of days ago was on why programmers don't want to use stack analysis tools. And if you're trying to build secure software, you have to find out why is this tool not being used. And they had a beautiful methodology section, controlled dialogue, etc., and making sure the bias of who's doing the dialogue is taken care of and things like this. But it was all qualitative. And you can't reproduce it because reproducibility is not important. The important thing is how relevant it is to both practitioners and the future work.
So you continue to engage in the hobby of disagreeing with me, Sam.
Hey, everyone needs a
But I don't mind. So you said that it's just you sort of two things you said struck me. One of them is that none of the experiment types have mentioned qualitative results, but in fact, except for meta-analyses and random controlled trials, all the rest of the studies can be either quantitative or qualitative. So it's not true that those study types didn't address qualitative results. And the second point is that, while I might agree with you about, the relevance of repeating something, but maybe not others, that's not what this panel is about. This panel is about repeatability and reproducibility. So if the group or the moderator wants to expand the scope of that, well, I guess that would be okay, but it seems a little unfair to attack the panel for something that wasn't the panel's remit in the first place.
I knew it would be lively.
Yeah, I'll continue on the expansion theme. And I don't know if this is true, but I'll throw it out there. Maybe part of doing cyber science or cybersecurity is more like astronomy. We take good measurements. It's hard to repeat stuff in astronomy. You really don't have experiments. You observe. You observe. You take data, and you have theories. You ask, how does the data apply to the theories how do the theories apply to the data I see? Where what I'm doing is basically an observer. Maybe we need to observe more in cyber, not only observe in the lab where we can control some of the variables, but just observe in the real internet better.
Or measure better.
Or measure better, yes. Observe and measure to me are the same thing.
Carl?
So I wanna come back at you a little bit on that. I think, granted that computing systems are complex and large and span the globe, but they're designed objects. They're not supernova in some distant place that we can't reach. And so I kind of object to thinking about the systems in that way because I think it's a defeatist attitude when in fact what we're dealing with most of the time is engineering defects, I would say. And that's the science that we're looking at here is the science because almost all of the attacks that we see now are a function of people coming in through engineered flaws. They're not, they're not anything else. So the red team to me looks like somebody who's conducting the same kind of experiment I do about every day if I get on the belt, okay? Which is, what's the shortest path from here to there? Well, I don't know today because there's a traffic jam over here. It's actually a little worse than that because what they're finding is holes which the engineer may be able to patch. Hopefully the engineer can learn how to design better as a result. I think that's the real goal and where the science really is.
I think you're right, Carl, but I think there's also a tension here, and the tension is that we are constantly building these systems and we're constantly throwing technology into them. And that's going to happen forever into the future. And even if you have changes that can make systems more secure, and we know what they are, it's almost impossible to get them into the design cycle if they're too disruptive.
Right, but that's a very serious problem, which is how to get people to adopt these things. And I'll give an argument that Terry's heard me give before, which is we need to find mechanisms that will do that. I think over time, civilization found out how to build buildings that don't fall down. Okay, a lot of what we learned about that happened before we knew the science. Actually, it's when we were doing engineering and we figured out what worked and we replicated that and we developed. When disasters happened, we developed building codes for those things. And I think we need to do essentially the same thing. And I think we need the science there to support the argument for the building code that we need for the systems that we really depend on.
I mean, I think we're at the cusp of that in a sense. I think we've had now some number of years of design, build it, try it, see what happens, and we're engaged in this conversation for exactly the right reason. And, some of us have been engaged in it for a number of years now. We're getting a little tired of it, but we do see more of a movement. You have people like Roy, and he's not the only one in the country that are now teaching classes, that are beginning to say, here's how you do a science of, here's how you do, Fred Schneider does a lot of work in this area. How do you do experimental cyber science? There's an effort to try and have experimental facilities available to researchers, to software designers, so that we can begin to elucidate what are those scientific principles. And so I think, that's really where we need to be putting more energy into, is to be able to start abstracting the principles, which I think one of the two of you said, you said, what are the five principles, that we have written down. We're not there yet. And similarly, I also have a concern about the word measurement. A lot of people are talking about measurement, and measurement is, that flip side of being able to understand whether or not we're doing things, we measure what our effects are of the different things we're doing. And unfortunately, I don't think we yet know how, we don't know what we're measuring, because we're not measuring against a set of principles. We're just, I see people that just measure for the sake of measuring. People come into my test bed and say, I'm just gonna run TCP dump on a 5,000 node experiment. Great, we're ready to see what you do, right? What do you expect to get out of that and why?
I gotta laugh, because what Terry said is right. But doing TCT bump on, on 5,000 nodes, that isn't measurement, that's just logging.
Logging.
I think we probably are straying off topic, but one last comment about what Carl said is maybe some of that could be driven as cyber or the internet moves more from an informational system into a cyber physical system. I mean, it's one thing when consequences are people lose information and you have all this fraud going on. It's another thing when physical effects start to happen. Maybe that's when lawyers will get involved, and when lawyers get involved, there'll be penalties for designing bad systems.
I think that's a very real possibility.
Well, and the folks, like we've already seen here, who have a background in the physics, and understand some of the physical laws in the other areas, may start interacting with our cross-cultivating our cyber community and help them bring those laws in.
So question, is there a difference between the large-scale systems level and more like the stuff you do where you're doing keystroke dynamics that are it's a very small contained thing that's much easier to deal with?
What difference in what?
In
the ability
to reproduce. And
Oh, well, I think the difference is kind of, I was going to say qualitative, but maybe I shouldn't say that. It's just in scale. Right? So the bigger something is, the harder it is to measure, mainly because it has many more dimensions.
so what do you do with that scale?
What do I personally do?
Yeah, what do you do at the large scale then? How do you handle that? How do you handle reproducibility?
Well, I mean, first of all, for me personally, if I was going to experiment with large-scale systems, I probably wouldn't have a large-scale hypothesis. I'd probably have a pretty focused hypothesis. And then that helps me to deal with the scale of the system, whatever that is. Right? That's one reason why it's helpful to start with an anticipated claim or a hypothesis, because it narrows the scope of what you have to do and what you have to measure. But that said, in my own work, it's my habit to measure everything I can measure.
He's the guy running the TCP dump.
I'm undertaking some new work now in my laboratory where I'm going to measure the expressions on people's faces as they participate in experiments in our lab. What am I going to do with this information? Me personally, nothing, right? But I have the opportunity to do this, and I know of other people in other disciplines who would love to have data like that, but they don't have it, and they can't get it. And so I'm collaborating with those people now, not on any kind of joint work that I'm going to do with them, but rather on the data that I plan to get that I can give to them so they can do something sensible with it later, right? So it's just my personal predilection to measure what you can, because once the experiment is over, you can't go back and remeasure that. But getting back more closely to Laura's question, how do you deal with scale? I think what you have to do is divide and conquer.
Laura, can we use the microphone?
Yeah. You'll help me run.
Yeah.
So this is, I guess, related to the measuring whatever. So what would be the difference between, say, an exploratory research protocol versus a hypothesis-driven research protocol? Where in the exploratory, you have a bunch of data and you're trying to identify what's interesting, versus a hypothesis-driven where you come to the data with an idea of what you're trying to find.
Well, in general, that's what case studies are for, the things at the bottom of the hierarchy that I talked about. But even in exploratory work, it's not like you don't have some at least loose hypothesis about what's going on, because you need somehow to focus your work, right? And in the material that I just talked about getting facial images, I don't even know if I said that, but that's what we're going to do, is we're going to get facial expressions. And it's not without a hypothesis that we do that, right? So the hypothesis is that you can discern what somebody's emotional state is, or their state of stress, by looking at their facial expressions or changes in their facial expressions. So I know quite a lot about how to do these kinds of things, but not about facial expressions. And I'm probably not the one who's ever going to do that, but the people who are good at doing that have definite hypotheses about what to look for, and they're helping me to design my experiments so that the data that I can give them is going to be useful to them, and not some, just not some train wreck mess that nobody can use and that I went through a lot of trouble to get, and then it's going to be kind of useless. So I understand why you maybe thought that what I said was exploratory, but it's maybe a little less exploratory than I represented it. But
I was just talking about in general, in terms of repeatability, where you have, say, for example, a public data set, and you have different people from the research community coming at it. So the data has been collected, say, from Facebook or Twitter, and you have, say, political scientists who are coming at it and trying to find what's interesting in that particular data set that might be temporal, so they can look at the time slices. They don't have necessarily a hypothesis, but they want to see what's interesting in the data, having not collected the data themselves.
Yeah, well, that's usually done by some kind of machine learning technique or clustering technique or something like that, right? You just figure out what the dimensionality of the data is, and you run it through various of these kinds of cluster type algorithms, and you see what pops out, and then given whatever it is that you happen to know about the domain, you ask whether there's something surprising or interesting there.
This is kind of like a tangent, but related to what you were talking about. Just out of curiosity, how do you expect to get IRB for just collecting data for facial expressions that you don't want to use? Now, what restrictions these things are related to?
It's a really great gotcha attempt. I don't expect any problem at all. And the reason is because the facial expressions are directly related to the research we're doing, and also because the other guy at his institution has an IRB too, right? So both institutions are collaborating on the IRBs. It won't be a problem. We thought about that.
So I have a general question based on an experience I had arguing with some of the newer graduate students in information security via social media. And I am a big proponent of reproducibility in the experiments we perform, whether it be we're developing a new spam detection system or intrusion detection system, pretty much every systems paper in computer security. And the response I got from a number of the students was, what's the point of reproducibility? What's the use of that? And so I was wondering if the panelists have suggestions for how we can sort of evangelize these basic sort of scientific principles to the up-and-coming students who will eventually become senior researchers, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, it's hard for me to say. I came from a science background. I don't think a lot of people in these fields come from science backgrounds. When you come from science backgrounds, this is sort of one of the core principles about how you're taught to approach problems. I think when you come from a computer background, and I've also worked in a startup company doing computer science type work, you just try things, and if it works, you say, let's go forward with it. And hopefully, by getting to market first, I will have something that whatever makes me rich. I mean, I just think it's a very different mindset when you don't come from a science background.
Well, I mean, I think, my first snide remark was, well, they shouldn't be in grad school. They don't understand that. I would use that personally as a bar before I'd let somebody into my program. But I think the other thing is, I think all of us as a community need to raise the bar. And so, one of the things that I'm fond of remarking on is, unfortunately, in computer security and even in some computer science areas, it's pretty easy to publish a result which is not reproducible or analyzable by our colleagues. And oftentimes, even using test beds, which of course, I'm the great evangelist of test beds, right? Even using test beds, on the SOSP and the operating system, right? You can publish anything if you ran it on Emulab. But you ran it on Emulab once and nobody ever sees it, nobody can ever run it again, but you can publish it, right? So, I think that as a community, and that's part of the mission kind of goal of, I think, this workshop and the workshop organizers here, is we should go out and work with all the different publication venues to raise that bar, and so that reproducibility becomes a requirement. So in cryptography and in mathematics and in physics and other areas, you don't normally publish unless you have something that can truly be peer reviewed. And there was, I'll go a little bit another tangent. This morning there was some discussion about, well, shouldn't the data be visible and how do we make that available? And maybe Sam or Carl has a little bit more information, but I know that the NSF has been pushing on data management. Now when you submit a proposal to the NSF, you have to have a data management plan, right? And the Office of Cyber Infrastructure has put a lot of work into sustainable cyber infrastructure for the science-based communities to make their data available. And large data stores for scientific analysis is really a leading edge in a lot of research communities. And so we in computer science and computer security, need to start introducing those disciplines.
I give you some incentives.
If not getting to grad school isn't enough.
So one would be 6 months on. Could you reproduce that figure for me based on whatever data you had 6 months ago? Okay, try that. Okay. My bet is that none of those students will be able to do that without a lot of hard work, and maybe even the figure won't come out the same the second time. So that's one. The second one is, if you ever get called to task in the literature, by somebody who can't reproduce your experiment, you don't want to be on that kind of shaky ground, especially where these days people are getting pretty bold about pointing out in the literature that so-and-so's experiment doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. And as I said before, I wouldn't want to be in the hot seat on something like that. Another reason is because when you publish something, if it attracts some interest in the field, and let's just say that your method section was less than perfectly adequate, then it's going to attract a lot of questions, right? So there's going to have to be a lot of email traffic and a lot of explanation about just exactly how it was that something happened. So, like in my lab, we put our stuff on a web page. We put the data there, we put the algorithms there, we put the methodologies there, and in all the time we've had that up there, we've only ever gotten one query about it. And the question was, why is it that you dropped some subjects along the way? Well, which was, a really excellent question. And in our papers, we never said anything about having dropped subjects. But if you look at the web page and you look at the data sets and the subject numbers, the subject number, I think the first subject number is number 1, and I don't know what the last subject number is, but it's not 51, but there are 51 subjects. So, maybe the last subject number is 68 or 79, or I don't even know what. And there's a bunch of subjects in between there that are missing. The subject numbers are missing, right? And so the guy says to me, why did you drop those subjects? Well, what we've forgotten to say in the paper, it just never occurred to us, the web page now says this. It is because we were running many experiments simultaneously, And we started the subject numbers at number 1, irrespective of what experiment you were in. So the people who did, experiment A, they might not have been consecutive, right? So that's one point where we got a little bit burned by not having been, totally explicit. But my point more in general is, the more reproducible your work is, the less time it takes for you to explain to other people what happened. And in the event that you are in a position where you have to explain something, it's going to be a lot easier. So there are 3 points that you might share with your students.
Just one very light comment from Terry's about not being a criteria to get into graduate school. I remember looking back at all the people I know that didn't stay in graduate school went to be quantitative traders on Wall Street.
Rebecca had a question.
So I have 2 questions. I think one's a little more discreet and easier. I'm thinking about how if I were to have a website and share a lot of the data that I do on human subjects, well, most of my data, I've told IRB that I won't share their information beyond the investigators. So how can I be sure that I fully anonymize any data that I do want to share? I think there's a lot of questions about anonymity and whether I can actually do that. So that's one question. And then I think my other question is, I don't actually agree that the academic structure incentivizes reproducibility. It seems like there's a lot more incentive to get a lot of papers out, and it's very hard to publish, as we found, reproducible or no results. So how do we deal with this? It's not going to, this incentive is not going to get my career any further if I am meticulous and I start by reproducing the study, as opposed to just building off of it.
So, well, I think let's take the publication of data as the first point. If you clear that through the IRB, you're golden. So that's where I would start. And I guess I would also say, if you're unable to share your data, let me state this from a different perspective, my own perspective. If I was anticipating a project where I couldn't share the data, I'd choose some other project, because I see not being able to share the data as a real impediment to doing good science and to helping other people do good science. And since that happens to be my personal interest, I just wouldn't do the project. This is the reason I got out of intrusion detection, because I thought all the data was junk, and even the junk data you couldn't share. So I just thought, there's no science here, what's the point? So I quit. As to your remark about the incentive to do rigorous work, I completely understand you. I've even had students in my own course say to me, Roy, we understand what you're telling us is exactly right. But while I'm putting all this effort into being, accurate and rigorous and all that sort of a thing, my colleague down the hall published 2 papers. And it's clear that the Open Security Conference, for example, doesn't really care about all of this, so why should I bother? Well, that's a personal decision, I think, that somebody has to make. Maybe one makes those decisions at different points along one's career trajectory. For me, I have a hard time sleeping if I'm doing what I think is bad science. Other people make other decisions, but I'm completely empathetic to your point of view. And I think that until the community demands more rigor, then to take the approach that you have suggested seems like the optimal thing to do, unless you want to be known as a rigorous scientist.
So I just sort of want to echo a little bit about what Roy said. I mean, I think for those of us at a later place in our career, you know, it's incumbent upon us to try and, you know, change the, you know, program committees and review processes as much as we can. And it's gonna be a gradual process. But there needs to be some changing, you know, in that. And I think, as we said earlier to Carl, I think we are on the cusp. We're sort of at a tipping point, perhaps. You know, maybe not soon enough for your particular career, but for others. I would not take as hard of a line as Rory about sharing data. I think that there's a whole research field on anonymizing data. And you know, in the network trace area, Doug Mon has the PREDICT program. You know, and we've done a lot of work on how we can share data and what we can do, you know, to make it anonymous. And so, you know, I would encourage you to reach out to others that are doing research in that area to help you bridge that gap. I thought Dave had his hand up.
Just one more thing. You said something about publishing venues for negative results. And I just wanted to comment that that's what this precise forum here is all about. So maybe you've arrived in the place where there's a place to start.
Thanks for the plug.
I wanted to follow up on Roy's comment. In particular, how do you respond to those students who say they understand what you're saying, but then they point to the you know, the other guy down the hall who's publishing 2 papers? In particular, you know, to Lance, how you were talking about science community. How do they address that? And then Roy, how do you respond to that student? Do you explain that they're being a little too short-sighted, and the guy down the hall may not eventually get the Nobel Prize, whereas if they wait it out, who knows?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a really great response for you, but I will say that normally in a class period, from the moment that some student will raise that question, the discussion will then last until the end of the class period, irrespective of how early the question was asked. And you know, it's very hard to respond to that because there's a lot of peer pressure to behave in one particular way when it seems pretty clear, but almost from a moral point of view, that you ought to be behaving in some other way, right? You know, people in some sense have to serve their own personal best interest. You know, some people will buck that to some extent. So it's a personal choice. And you know, what I usually say to students at the end of the day is, it's just a matter of what you can personally live with.
Laura, do we have anybody online who wants to ask any questions?
We haven't had any questions so far. There are about 6 people online.
Alethea, I thought you were going to ask some questions.
Well, you know, Roy said that the panel wasn't asked about whether reproducibility was important or not. We seem to have gotten back on the topic. So, about the issue of whether it's important or not, again, qualitative studies, it's actually the issue where it's immoral not to do qualitative studies. I mean, for example, way back when there was a big issue in the community of asthma medicine, that asthma patients weren't taking a medicine properly. And there was tons of studies about investigating sort of what patients had what level of compliance with what the recommended doses were, and was not clear. And there were studies which had insignificant results, or which significant results in opposite directions. And there was confusion. So someone finally said, okay, fine, I won't do this, and did a qualitative study, basically. And what was happening was patients who paid attention realized that this was addictive medicine, and therefore would deliberately dosing themselves just so that they wouldn't get intolerance. And nobody had noticed this in all the quantitative studies because this wasn't one of the parameters. And you get more information through qualitative means often than in quantitative studies. And if you want to progress science, you have to be open towards these other mechanisms.
No argument there. But I mean,
actually have a,
What?
We do
Let me just respond to what Sam
yeah,
said.
respond to that, and then I actually do have an online question.
So, Sam, I think, well, I don't disagree with a single thing you said. The only thing that I'd point out, to just kind of expand on your point, is that, you know, irrespective of whether it's a qualitative or a quantitative study, the thing that I think is important about what you said is that somebody asked a really important question and decided to get to the bottom of it by whatever mechanism it was possible to use. And that's really the essence of science, I think. For me it is, right? You have some question, you have some phenomena that you can't understand, figure out how to ask the question and how to get an answer to it. And I think this is essentially what you said, and probably a lesson to everybody here, that's really, at the end of the day, our ultimate objective is to answer these questions. I hope I understood you correctly.
Right.
Hey, you guys agreed, I don't know, something wrong.
So the question is, and now the person's followed up with a second one. A talkative person, and please identify yourself. To all the panel, why and how are the challenges of the 3 Rs different in cybersecurity as compared to other sciences? Where do you think cybersecurity science is compared to other sciences? And that's Alethea. Give it to Terry.
That's not fair.
Why should the 3 Rs be any different in cybersecurity than they are in any other domain or discipline? Is that essentially it, Laura?
Well, she wanted to know how the challenges are different. Are the challenges
Well,
different in
Lance,
cybersecurity? And if so, how?
Oh, okay. Well, so my personal opinion is no, they're not that different. I mean, we have adversarial relationships in other domains, you know, like biology. You have critters that are after you all the time in ways that you don't really understand why. I mean, we often use adversariality as a scapegoat here. I mean, my view is it's the hand you were dealt, right? So just figure out some way to solve the problem. But as for the 3 Rs, right, do we have challenges in this community? Well, we do for some reason, but I don't personally see why it's any different than it is anywhere else. I suspect that the reason we view things as different is because of the educational process. So in other domains, as people come up through undergraduate school and graduate school, they're taught differently how to deal with the kinds of problems that we have in cybersecurity, and in computer science, they generally are not.
And I don't think this is absolute, but I do think one way in which these two fields do differ, meaning cyber from science, a lot of science and a lot of engineering that stems from science is very reductionist. If you understand the parts, you can start to understand how you compose the parts to get systems that have properties. I don't think security is composable. And that really adds a lot of confounding factors to it, because when you put two things together that are secure, you can result in an unsecure system.
Laura, there's another online. Did you want to do them?
Oh, it was the same person.
Okay.
This is Frank from University of Maryland. I just wanted to, I guess, kind of jump on if I could try to answer the question that was, proposed by the person, I guess it was Alethea. I'm starting to think maybe it's because cybersecurity is dealing with man-made phenomena, whereas the natural sciences deal with natural phenomena, and that I think also relates to whether it's composable or not. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that, but we've got these computer systems that are made by people, and they have flaws in them. I'm just curious if anyone else has any other thoughts.
Kind of like bridges, huh?
Okay, and this was the last question, because we're going to have to close out and move to our next session.
Well, you want a response?
Do you want a response?
I did, so, but yeah. I guess the only thing I would ask you is that, if you think that the big difference is that we're dealing with man-made systems instead of natural systems, I don't think you've gone far enough. You need to explain what is your rationale in thinking that that is in fact what the big difference is. I acknowledge that there is, you know, I mean, we do have natural systems on the one hand and man-made systems like bridges or buildings, right, on the other hand. But you haven't really said what it is specifically that distinguishes those two enterprises that would make the difference that you're claiming to explain.
Yeah, I do think part of it is when you're dealing with a natural system and you discover something, that tends to remain true forever. I mean, Newton's laws were true before he discovered them, they were true after he discovered them. Now, there's certainly ranges of applicability. You can't take Newton's law into high gravity fields and expect them to give you the right answers, okay? But still, when you establish something in a natural science, it tends to remain true within the context in which it's true. I'm not sure that's true in cybersecurity.
Laura, are we ready to wrap up?
Yep. So would everybody please thank our panelists?